right, well, we might get started, I think. I'm sure we'll have a few more people pop in over the next few minutes or so, and they will catch up to wherever we're up to. But I think we'll get going because we do have quite a lot to get through with this grant writing webinar. There's a lot of detail in grant writing, and we try and step you through a process for managing all that detail, and it does mean we've got a lot to cover. To start with, I'm Kelly. I'm one of the sector development team here.
Yeah, anything, tea or coffee,
QCOS.
Hand of anything.
That's Queensland Council of Social Service.
Thanks, staff.
For anyone who's not familiar, we are one of the peaks in the community sector. If you are dialing in from elsewhere, you might be familiar with the Council of Social Service in your state or territory. So our job is really to be supporting and resourcing the sector. And one of the ways that we do that is through providing guidance on things like how to put forward strong applications for grants and other funding opportunities, which is why we're here today. QCOS has been doing grant writing webinars and workshops and things for many, many years. And we have started in the last couple of years focusing in on specific grants that come up regularly. So if you're particularly interested today in the Community Innovations Fund grant round, which we believe will be opening soon, that's what we'll be using as our example grant. But what we'll be talking about in terms of the strategies and what to include in grants, how to prepare and plan your applications, all of those sorts of things are relevant across the range of grants that are out there. The same sort of principles apply. The assessors are looking for similar sorts of things, so you'll be able to use the process that we talk about here for whatever grant you're looking at applying for. Before we do get into that, though, we want to recognise and pay our respects to the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on. QCOS does thank First Nations people for the gift of the Uluru Statement from the Heart, and we look forward to working hand in hand with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people going forward in a more positive direction and doing the work of reconciliation. In particular, I want to acknowledge the Yagara and Turrbal people of the land that I work on and am privileged to live on. And I encourage you, if you would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that you're coming in from in our chat. So, as we get started, and for those of you who have just joined, we are only just getting started. So you haven't missed any content so far, just a few introductions. If you would like to let us know in the chat what you're hoping to get out of today's webinar, that would be great. Some people would like or are comfortable sharing the grant they're considering applying for, or a little bit else about the project they're thinking about trying to get funded. And it can be really great to share ideas. So please feel free to use the chat to do that as we go ahead. What I will do is move ahead with our slides, but we'll be checking in with the chat regularly, and if you have any questions or comments or things you'd like to share, just pop them in there, and they will appear on one of my screens, and I'll do my very best to answer as many questions as I can. Don't feel like you need to be writing much down as we go through. You will get an email once we've finished up that includes the slides from today and links to a few other resources. So just, stay engaged, and please do contribute anything you'd like in the chat. It really does liven things up when we have a bit of a discussion going, rather than just me talking at you for 2 hours. All right, so we have a few purposes for the workshops that we run on grant writing, and that's really because writing grant applications can be a surprisingly complex process. So the first thing that we want to think about is finding the right grant, and that means finding a grant that matches with the purpose of your organisation and the project that you want to get funded. The sort of meat of our discussion will be focused on making sure that you're ticking all the boxes in your application when you're developing your responses to selection criteria for the grants that you're looking at. And we'll also be highlighting a few common mistakes that applicants for grants make, and some tips that we've got from funders and from grant assessors to help you avoid those mistakes in whatever grant you are currently looking at. So, as I said earlier, we will be looking at the Community Innovations Fund, or CIF, grant as our example for some of the worked slides that we have worked examples later on, but the same principles apply across the range of grants or things that you might be looking for. Oh, lovely. So we've got another person down here in the southeast looking for a better grounding in grant writing. Thank you, Lee. That is exactly what we hope to give you. So I trust that you will get that by the end of the webinar today, and you will get links to some other resources as well. So hopefully we can satisfy that for you. Quick rundown on what we're going to be going through. So as I mentioned, finding the right funding opportunity. Then we're going to look at some planning. So the things that you might do before you actually start writing, which can often be missed. Writing tips and tricks, and specifically in relation to grant assessment criteria. Providing some evidence to support your claims, which is really commonly missed in grant applications. And then right before we wrap up, we're going to have a little look at the Human Rights Act 2019, because for most of the grants that you get, particularly state government grants in Queensland, if you are successful in getting a grant, you will then be what's considered a functional entity under that Act. So just being familiar with the requirements there is really useful. So before we jump in, interested in hearing if you have had any experience in writing grant applications before, and if you have, what you learnt from that. If you want to share anything on that point, please do in the chat. In the meantime, I can see we've got a few more comments so we're looking at learning stronger processes and formats for grant writing. That's a great question. There's a really specific sort of formula that we recommend for grant writing, because it's a different type of writing to others. More supports or resources for grant writing, that's great. We've got mention of a couple of specific types of grants. Lots of people from QAIHC, which is very cool. It is really helpful. We know for grant writers, when there is a team or members who will be contributing to the same grant writing process, all coming to training together, we often have teams from the same organisation, and it's really helpful because they then get versed in the same sorts of principles and processes and can then support each other in implementing them. So that's fabulous to see. So we have... yes, Elizabeth is saying, recently applied for a grant and found the need to write within word limits was, yeah, that's a big one, and one we'll talk about a bit later, with some tips on how to take out any extraneous words so that you're not going over those word limits or character limits. We've got a question, I hope to have a look at how to cost initiatives. That's really important. We will be talking a little bit about budgeting and how to put a realistic budget together later on. That is great. Oh yes, I didn't define my acronym earlier. Sorry, Queensland Aboriginal and Islander Health Council. Thanks, Lee. We have so many acronyms, don't we, that we throw around. A little bit of alphabet soup there. Okay. So I think a couple of things that came through in the chat that are really important and that you'll hear us sort of refer back to over and over again through here are that it does take a lot of time to put together applications, and that can be quite surprising, I suppose, particularly for first-time applicants. There are some things that just seem on the surface like they might be quite quick or simple, and then they turn out to take a lot more time than it is expected. And it can be really important to get everyone in the team on the same page and make sure that there are people across an organisation who can have effective input into the process as well. So just a little bit about our example fund, the Community Innovation Fund or CIF. So Community Innovation Fund is a Queensland Government grant, like many of the grants that you'll probably be applying for or are interested in applying for. It's a big part of the big Plan Communities 2023. It has been funded with 2 different levels of funding and has been open just for a couple of years now, I think, with several quite big organisations rolling out some programs and some smaller ones as well. And the really big focus is for the CIF grants is on programs that are innovative, as the name suggests. So looking for programs that do something a little bit different from what's been done before. CIF is funded through the Department of Treaty, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Partnerships, Communities and the Arts. That is a very long department name, so you'll just hear me refer to it as the department for the rest of the presentation. If you hear me say the department, that's what I mean. If I mean a different department, I'll use the other department's name. So the CIF grants are really aimed at reducing social isolation, increasing social connections, and was part of the response to the increased awareness of loneliness and social isolation across communities. That sort of awareness, I think, was growing in advance of the COVID pandemic and the changes that brought about, but certainly has only increased since then. So what we will do as we go through the examples, this is the grant that I will be using as our worked example. And I'm hoping that through that you'll see, even if there are other grants that you're looking for rather than CIF, you will see how to think about matching up what your project aims to do, what your organisation aims to do with the aims of the grant program that you're applying for, and you'll be able to just transfer all of those same processes that I talk about to the grant that you're interested in. All right. So the first thing that we do when we're looking at whether to apply for a grant is consider what the funder is looking for. And this applies across any grants. There will be specific criteria that they want an application to meet. In the case of the Community Innovations Fund grants, we know that there are a few key things that the department looks for and their assessors look for. The first is that the organisation that is applying has really strong connections within their community, including partnerships that can support and broaden what they're delivering. That the applicant understands really deeply the nature of the community and the needs that are there. So the idea is that the project that the applicant is applying for funding for is really tailored to the specific community. It's not trying to roll out something that, seems like a good idea because it worked somewhere else. It really is targeted towards the specific area, and community organisations are really well placed to provide those sorts of ideas because community organisations are integrated with the community and are always responding to community needs. The CIF funders are really looking for, as I said, innovative projects, but along with all other grant projects, they want applications that are really realistic and financially feasible as well. And we'll go a little bit more into what that feasibility looks like later. And the final one, and this is increasingly common across different grants, is that the proposals that funders receive, they really want to see that those proposals have a cultural responsiveness integrated into their design. So that's the foundation for the example grant that we're using today. There will be some differences with the different kinds of grants that you want to be applying for, but as I said, the principles and processes we talk about will be the same across the board. So what is that methodology that I keep referring to? It's quite a detailed one, but as you'll see, or as you would already know as well if you have applied for a grant previously, is that it's a big job and it's a really detail-focused job. So we do have a 10-step process here, and you'll see that it isn't actually until step 7 that we start writing the application at all. That can come as a bit of a surprise because we think of writing the application as the main part, but it actually in most grant application processes comes in quite late on. So the focus here is on meeting the requirements of the funding body, so the provider of the grant you're applying for. And because we are focused on the community sector, most of those grants are also looking at benefits both to a specific participant group or target group, but also to the broader community. We do have a video here. I'm not going to play it just in the interests of time, but what you'll find when you get the presentation in the email that will come in the next day or so is that this is a live link, so you can just click on it and watch it yourself in your own time. It is from the Victoria Law Foundation, so it's not a Queensland video, but it's got really relevant and useful tips in it. And it's the sort of thing that you might like to think about sharing with your team or people that you're working in partnership on a grant if they haven't had the opportunity to do some training in grant writing. These sorts of resources can be really useful. So let's move on to our first part, the preparation for grant writing. So we're going to look at 3 steps within this. Finding the right grant, understanding your organisation and building relationships as the sort of foundations for writing an effective application. So finding the right grant is a bit of a tricky one because it's not unusual to have a bit of a backwards process where a grant gets announced and an organisation really wants to fund a program, so they will tweak what the program looks like in order to meet the criteria of a particular grant. And that doesn't tend to work especially well. Apart from anything else, assessors tend to be able to see that something isn't quite lining up when that happens. So the first thing that we want to highlight is the need to actually look at what grants are available and then see if there is one that suits the idea you want to go forward with, rather than trying to tailor an idea to the requirements of a grant. In the case of our example grants, the Community Innovations Fund, we've got a super competitive grants process here. In one round, there were over 300 applications and only 10 of those were successful. So you can see with numbers like that how important it is that the people who are writing applications are really, really keenly focused on the specific requirements of the grant. And this means that in your application, you need to demonstrate that you understand the purpose of the fund and that your project is a good match for that purpose. There will be guidelines that are freely available for all of the sort of legit grant opportunities that are out there. You can usually find those just by Googling the name of the grant and then funding guidelines or guidelines for funding. If you can't find those guidelines freely available, that might mean that it's worth asking some extra questions about the grant. And as you can see here from the department, we've got the funding body's own sort of way of expressing the core thing that they're looking for in applications, which is proposals that present new approaches to combating social isolation and loneliness. And what we can see there is that they've really got a strong sense of what they're looking for, and that's what they're going to be weighing up the different projects or proposals against. And that even though the details will differ, that will be the same for any grant that you apply for. There will be assessors who look at your application to see whether it's ticking all the boxes that they need it to tick. Can be really useful, by the way, to have a chat to the funding body before you put together an application, or in the process of putting together the application. There should be a contact person listed in the funding guidelines or other information about the grant. And they will usually be more than happy to spend some time having a chat to you about your idea and whether it lines up with the purpose of the grant. So in the case of our example fund, we're looking at innovative approaches to addressing social isolation and loneliness that identify target groups that are at heightened risk. And that when we break that down, we can see the core things that our project needs to do. And if we think, oh, I'm not sure I'm 100% on one of those factors, that's an indication that we might need to look at other grant opportunities and see if there's something that matches up better. There's also some secondary purposes to the Community Innovation Fund. We've got increasing community understanding of social isolation and loneliness, including the things that create barriers to engaging with social groups or activities, support networks, all of those sorts of things. We want to see participants getting greater community connections, reduced exclusion or marginalisation, and even building the ability of local organisations or groups to respond to people who are in the process of experiencing isolation or loneliness. So knowing what the purpose of the fund is, we can think about eligibility. Now, this is another one of those things where it should absolutely be clear in the funding guidelines. Sorry, almost got that got my wording mixed up there. Who is eligible to apply should be made crystal clear. In the case of our example organisation, there's 7 types of, in the case of our example grant, there are 7 types of organisation that can be eligible. So if you were going for a CIF grant, you would just need to make sure that you maybe you are in an incorporated association, for example. You would just need to check your organisation's founding documents to make sure that that was made clear, that sort of thing. There are a few more requirements for the Community Innovations Fund grants. There must be public liability of at least 10 million, and then there are some eligibility around the initiative itself. So obviously it needs to be targeted at reducing social isolation and loneliness. That's the purpose of the fund. But in the case of this grant, they're also looking specifically at particular at-risk or hard-to-reach populations. So they want to see applications that address that and which are culturally responsive. The take-home here is that there will be a set of requirements for the grant that you are interested in applying for. They may look more or less similar to the ones here for the CIF grants, but whatever those requirements are, if you don't meet the eligibility criteria, you're down at the first hurdle. They're not going to look at the rest of your application and think, oh, well, this is really worthwhile. It looks like a great idea, so maybe we'll just sort of squeeze this one in even though the eligibility criteria aren't met. The grant assessment process is really strict. if you're not eligible, it doesn't matter how good your idea is, it won't be considered. So the, first up really is checking whether your organisation and your project idea aligns with the purpose and eligibility of the grant. We've got an example here of a misaligned purpose, and we're the kind of thing that, and this is a fictional one that we've developed, but that reflects the sorts of applications that funders often get where there isn't quite, well, there's very obviously not the alignment that they would like, but an organisation has tried to sort of tweak their idea so that it looks like it's the right kind of project for the purposes of the grant. So in this case, rather than having an innovative idea, the organisation has had a successful program in the past. They want funding to redo that program, basically, to roll it out again. There's nothing wrong with that. That's a perfectly legitimate thing to do. But in this case, it doesn't meet the requirements of SIF grants because they specifically need things to be innovative, and it's not going to fly. So I won't read that out to you. I know reading slides out can get a bit tedious, but you'll have that there to have a look at if you want to, have a chat, say, with other people you're in partnership with or members of your team in the grant writing process. It's for some learning around, or some guidance and thinking about how to check your alignment with a grant. So the sort of partner, I guess, to the purpose of the grant is the purpose of your organisation. Now, you will all have a sense of your organisational purpose, whether you're a giant national or multinational not-for-profit, or a small totally volunteer association that 3 hardworking people managed to pull off. You will have a set of values and a purpose or a mission for your organisation that you work towards. And this is your sort of prompt to stop and think about, okay, I've got this idea and I've got this grant that I might apply for to see if I can get funding to roll the idea out. But I need to double check that this is in line with what my organisation is all about, because there can be situations in which a grant is great and the idea is great, but if it doesn't fit with what the organisation is doing, then it's not going to be effective in practice. So you want to think about what your organisation does, what it does well, what it's got experience in delivering and showing that it can deliver, and sort of build your idea out from there. So you want to be thinking about, what do we do that supports the mission or the purpose of our organisation? How do we do it? What staff do we have for that? And does that whole setup then support the delivery of this idea that I've got for this program that I want to run? You also want to have a think about whether there are other organisations or services in your area who could run with your idea more effectively than you can, or whether it will be better to form a partnership with another organisation to deliver. So an example of that might be, say, you're working for a youth organisation and you have really strong experience in working with young people who are disengaged from education or employment, and you would like to use that to then support people across the age range who are disengaged. But you'll want to think about, is there an organisation that works with people who are in early adulthood, middle adulthood and older, who have expertise in that area, and can we come together in a partnership so that we can make sure that we've got the expertise and the experience and the community connections necessary to make a success of that. Now, what that looks like, of course, will depend on your organisation and your project idea. But regardless of the details, it's probably going to be really important that you have some partnerships or working relationships. And this is actually becoming more and more important within a whole range of grants. It is expected with Community Innovation Fund grants that delivery involves partnerships with other organisations. Another example of a grant program where this is essential is the Skilling Queenslanders for Work grants, which we have been on the road delivering training for at the moment. It's another grant that is currently open. And it's absolutely built around partnerships. It's built into how a lot of grants work now, and how it's expected that programs will not just be about delivering something directly to participants, but helping foster connections between participants and other elements of a community. Now, this can get really tricky because relationship and partnership building isn't easy. And this is one of those areas where it does often take a lot more time than people expect. So our advice when it comes to relationship building is to start this really early in the process. Expect that it will take longer than you think. Be proactive in reaching out to organisations or using the networks that you already have to explore ideas about who might like to work with you. Throw ideas around, brainstorm with those people. You know, they might have an idea that's similar but a bit different, and you might realise that that's actually going to work better, or you could meld your two sets of ideas, all of those sorts of things. And you can also have a chat to your funder about what sorts of relationships they think work for a particular program. So they might have some unique insights, especially if it's the grant is being assessed on a regional basis. Talking to your regional officers from the funding body can be invaluable. And the good news is with relationship building that community organisations do tend to do this really well. Most of us are engaged in networks, or we're really connected to different groups in the communities where we operate. So even though relationship building is a big job and it does take a lot of time, I think community services are already sort of ahead of the curve when it comes to establishing these relationships. I'm going to pause really quickly for a quick drink of water before we move on to planning. So this is a really good opportunity if you've got any questions about that first set of steps on, you know, really bedding down a foundation and preparing before we move on to the planning section. Okay. So we'll move on to planning, but if you do have questions about any of the earlier segments, don't hesitate to pop them in the chat, and if I don't get to them while we're going through the slides, I'll try and answer them at the end. Okay, so let's get into planning. So again, we've got 3 steps in this part of the process. We need to really start mapping out our project idea, and this, I guess, is where the rubber really hits the road. We need to get really specific about things, and we have a resource that I'll link you to that is just a 1-page project map that can be really useful. It helps highlight the really key parts of any project idea, and having that mapped out then makes actually writing an application much easier when you come to do that. And the next step is understanding the process, which is really about the actual step-by-step process of putting the application together, what your funder needs you to do. And then we're looking at planning ahead. So before you actually sit down to write, getting all the things you're likely to need together and having a plan for how you'll go about putting the application together beforehand. And again, as I mentioned earlier, it might seem like a surprise that there's so many steps before you actually sit down and write. But that's because this planning can actually save you a lot of time that you don't sort of realise you're risking if you jump straight into writing. And I just wanted to highlight a recent study that really, I guess, made this point better than we could ourselves. There was a Grants in Australia report that came out a few years ago, and it showed that over half of respondents to the survey that they rolled out said they'd started an application that they then didn't submit. So we've already got a huge amount of time and effort that's really valuable that's been wasted there, which is is not good for the people who, you know, put that effort in and invested it and then realised it wasn't going anywhere. And it can also be a real challenge for organisations. You know, we know community services often operate on shoestring budgets. So what we want to do is give you a process for this that reduces the risk that your valuable resources are going to be wasted. And we can get some useful lessons from what those people who had stopped an application process partway through said was behind the decision to stop. So almost 40% said they just plain ran out of time. So we've got some ideas coming up for how you can reduce the risk that you'll run out of time in this sort of process. Over a quarter said they dropped out partway through when they found that the program wasn't right for them. And that highlights what I was saying earlier about checking the requirements of a grant and sort of assessing that against your organisation's purpose or mission or strategy, and also the project idea that you have. And if you make sure that those match up in those first stages before you get into the writing, you can save the time of the risk, I suppose, that you might realise partway through the process that they don't actually work together. And if you do identify that they're not aligned early on, you can then put that time instead into finding a different grant that's probably going to be better suited to what you're doing. Another significant chunk of respondents said that they got partway through writing their applications and then realised they didn't even fit the eligibility criteria, which is another one of those in our first couple of steps to check. So if we do this planning process before we get into writing, we can minimise all of those risks. We can't necessarily get rid of them entirely, especially when it comes to running out of time, because there can be things that are outside of our control, particularly when another person or organisation has to be involved in some part of the process. But we can really reduce all of those risks. So we suggest you start by mapping out your project idea. And this, you know, this doesn't need to be absolutely detailed and sort of nailed down as to, you know, exact numbers of participants or days and hours, but getting as solid a sense as you can of what your idea is and how it would work in practice. And one of the things that's becoming more and more popular among funding bodies now is to see a solid program logic in the applications they receive. And program logic, or theory of change, is another term. These are basically sort of fancy terms for showing how your proposed activities lead to the outcomes that you want to see, and those outcomes, ideally, if you've done that check on alignment, being the outcomes that the funding body wants to see projects achieve. So working through the steps of developing a program logic will really help you first double check that alignment is there, but also potentially identify areas where there's a bit of a disconnect between the actual conditions on the ground and what you can deliver, or between what you can deliver and what the likely outcomes of that will be. This then will also help you figure out how you can evaluate your project. And evaluation is another one of those things that's becoming more and more important for funders. They don't just want to be investing in things that seem like a good idea. More and more often now, they want to, yes, be investing in things that seem like a good idea, but then get some evidence of the effectiveness of that, which they can then use going forward to inform what future projects that they fund. So if they say fund 10 projects and they see that 5 of those projects showed really good outcomes, but 5 showed, you know, less good outcomes, they can then look through the elements of those projects and see if they can find some, you know, likely things that influenced whether a project was likely to be effective or not, and they can then use that as part of their evaluation of in future funding rounds to see whether those elements of successful programs are reflected in the applications that they're getting through. A program logic isn't set in stone as soon as it's written. It is a bit of a living document that can be tweaked, but the key thing is that it really needs to be developed before the project starts. And that's when it's going to be most useful as well in terms of troubleshooting, helping you identify if you've made an assumption that may not actually be true, or where the activities you plan actually don't logically relate to the outcomes that you're looking for. But what we would like to sort of highlight, I guess, is that it's not essential that you have a program logic all fancily sort of graphic designed that you can put in with your applications. It doesn't have to be complex. You know, if you Google program logic, and you'll find some incredible diagrams. That's not what funders are looking for. But if you have a solid program logic, if you and your team really understand that, you will be better able to explain what you're doing and why you think it will be effective in your answers to the criteria for the grant application. So I'm going to run just really quickly through one strategy for developing a program logic, and that's called backcasting. I quite like backcasting because I find it sort of makes intuitive sense to me. You kind of work from what you want to achieve back in time, figuring out what you need to do to achieve that. And that just seems to me like a really intuitive sense to, in a lot of planning ways. We'll talk about something similar as well when we talk about actually planning as you put together what you need to for the application itself. So the first step in backcasting is to write a problem statement, which is where you try to really simply describe or define the problem that you're trying to address. So in the case of the Community Innovation Fund grants, that problem statement would be about isolation or loneliness. So it might be that recent research showed that people over the age of 75 in your local government area are showing increased rates of isolation or reduced community engagement over the past 5 years, something like that. You want to make it as just simple and basic as you can. Really, it doesn't have to be anything fancy, and in some ways with applications it's better if things aren't fancy. If you can explain things in a really simple way, that suggests that you understand them well. You then go from your problem statement, which is sort of at kind of the starting point, you jump right to the end point, which is what you would want to see if you had a really successful program. What would you want to see change? So if you wanted to reduce isolation among a particular group, you might think about outcomes that you would want to see being helping community members meet one another, helping them build social skills so that when they do meet one another, they're better able to establish and maintain relationships. You might want to be actively linking participants to community activities or ongoing community groups, linking them to voluntary work participation, all sorts of things. It's not, my point in these examples isn't to tell you what your program should be aiming for, but just that those are some of the things that you might want to see as outcomes for a program. And it can be really useful if you think not just about the problem that you've defined in your problem statement, but also what contributes to that problem, because that can help you identify some potential outcomes. So if you do note, for example, that it can be quite difficult for some people who don't drive to engage in community activities because they're not familiar with public transport, or they don't feel confident with public transport, you're going to need to use some different strategies to address that, as compared with if the barriers are around not having strong social skills, or because it's a new neighbourhood. You know, those are all things that would influence what you think would be required to meet each outcome. You can, if you have a whole bunch of outcomes that you want to achieve, you can group similar ones together. And so you want to have, you know, not too many things in your outcomes column, really. You then work backwards to if for outcome A, what steps are needed, what actions or outputs, what is your project going to do, what are the workers or the volunteers actually going to deliver that you hope will achieve those outcomes. So these steps are what we would call actions or outputs. Depending on which funding bodies you're used to dealing with, outputs might be a really familiar word to you. If it's not, it just means the actual things that the people running the project or the program do. And what you want to do, where program logic gets really useful, is you want to see whether the connections that you're making between the problem statement and the outputs, and then between the outputs and the outcomes, make sense. So you might think about whether the outcomes that you want to see really are likely to result from the actions. Maybe the actions and the outcomes aren't as well aligned as you thought they would be at the start. And then you can think through, or what else might be needed? You know, is one of the actions that you identified really positive, but there needs to be other supporting actions around it for it to actually be likely to achieve the outcome that you want to. So this is where it gets the use of the term logic comes in. The idea is that the program logic is about whether each aspect in the series is likely to lead on to the next aspect that you've identified. So are the actions really likely to lead to those outcomes that you want to see? We also want to have a look at whether those outcomes really do relate back to the problem statement. So you might find that there are outcomes you can identify that seem really positive, but in the case of our Community Innovations Fund example, if the outcomes are positive but they don't actually relate to as much to isolation and loneliness, you might question whether you've got the right project model there or whether there's something that you need to change. And one just tip that I would add for developing your program logic is make sure you get someone else involved in developing it and in reviewing it and assessing the logic of it. Because having someone else involved, especially say you and one of your teammates or someone from a partner organisation develop the program logic, and then you ask someone who wasn't involved in that development to evaluate it, they're likely to see things in it, particularly potential problems, things that don't quite add up, that you would have missed. And that's just because we all have more trouble reviewing our own work and seeing the problems in it than we would if we were looking at someone else's work. So that's just a really quick introduction to program logic. I mean, you can do whole courses on these things, so this is not a masterclass in it, but something to start thinking about as you develop your project plans and see if you can play around with it, see how you think it might work in practice. If you're really interested in program logic, we have a webinar coming up next week that goes into more detail with it as well. And there's some really useful resources online that I'll link you to in the follow-up email after today's session. The other thing that we suggest is our project on a page template. This is the mapping document that I mentioned earlier. And what this does is it really takes you step by step through different aspects of a project that you want to have really clear in your mind before you start putting your application together. Again, it might seem like this is a lot of preparatory work before you get into actually writing your responses to the application questions for your grant. But if you have all of these things clearly noted, what you'll find is then when you go to answer those assessment questions, you'll already have a lot of the information right to hand, and you'll be able to then translate your notes from the plan into those responses to the particular questions. And having that really simple, spelled out sort of overall plan will just make the writing process itself much, much easier. Again, you'll get a copy of this template in the email after the session, and there's copies available on our website as well. So the key things to think about when starting the planning process are our basic who, what, where and how questions. Most grants that are available really specify a target cohort, whether that is just a community within a geographical area or a particular demographic group. So it might be, a regional program targeted at the Cunnamulla community. That would be really broad. Or it might be get really, really into detail. So aimed at young people who are at risk of engagement with the legal system within the Bundaberg region. It can be really, those things can really vary. So you want to be specific about what your cohort is. And who else will be involved? Who might you be working with within your community? If you're going to have support from a network or you want a formal partnership, those sorts of things are going to be really important to nut out before you put your application together, because they'll really strongly influence what you can offer and how. The where is really critical. There are a surprising number of people or organisations who apply for grants, and then when they get the grants, they realise that they have to really scramble to get the right location to actually roll out their program, or that the place where they thought would be really useful is not accessible for some reason, all those sorts of things. So think about who your target cohort is and where it would be useful to hold events or services in relation to that cohort. If you want to hold things in an area where there isn't public transport, that could be a problem. If you're having group activities but the location that you're holding them isn't accessible to people with mobility challenges, that's going to be a problem. All of those sorts of things, just starting to think about that early on is going to save you a lot of headaches later. You need to have a really clear idea of what your project is. Obviously, if you're going for the Community Innovations Fund grant, you need to be clear about how it is innovative, what it is doing that is new. And either whether you're going for a Community Innovations Fund grant or something else entirely, you want to have evidence to show that what you're suggesting is needed within your community. You need to show that the target cohort in your area, in the area where you plan on delivering your project, is in need of the sort of thing that your project offers. And then you want to get into the real nuts and bolts of how you'll deliver on your plan. So with the Community Innovation Fund, the sorts of questions that we would want to be able to answer before we go into actually writing the application is how we'll be addressing isolation, how we'll be engaging our cohort, particularly because the CIF grants target either difficult to engage or really heavily marginalised people who face a lot of barriers to engagement. So how will you get those people involved in your project, and how will you measure the impact? Now, on that topic, we have a question here from John. Would the CIF funding help with startup? I think there's probably some difficulties there. There's quite a few things that CIF funding cannot cover, which we'll go into a little bit more when we talk about budgets. But a lot of grants, you'll find there are things that you would need to start up an organisation that won't be covered by the grant funding. So things like purchase of equipment, rent for properties, those sorts of things are often excluded. Not always. I don't take that as a universal statement, but there are quite a few things about setting up an organisation that wouldn't be covered by some grants. And you need to be really careful about looking at what the included and excluded costs for budgeting are. We'll get into that a little bit later, and the example I can show you might help clarify that. Okay, So now we're on to step 5, which is understanding the application processes itself. And again, it might seem a little bit strange to be exploring what the process is before you actually start writing the application. But there can be some surprisingly some surprising ways to trip up when it comes to this. A lot of application processes these days require you to have, for example, a registration with a particular online platform. And if you haven't set that up, or you're not sure what IT permissions you need within your organisation, if you are in an area where internet connectivity is a challenge, all of those sorts of things could really trip you up when you come to write your application. So checking out what the requirement is in advance is really useful. It's not all that common these days to be able to just email or post off a series of documents as an application. It really is much more common to have an online portal to use. There are some benefits to that. So there are some grants, for example, with portals where you can't progress your application unless you have answered every question that has preceded the next step. And that can be useful because it can act as a sort of alarm that you've missed something, which is really handy. But there are also some challenges. So if, for example, there's several people in your organisation who need to work on the application, you'll need to make sure that everyone's got access to the registration, or that everyone's sending their information to one single person who's then responsible for putting that information up on the portal and completing the application. Most applications will need someone else in your organisation to approve. So that might be, for example, what's the word I'm looking for? Your CEO or your general manager. It might be the president of your board of directors or management committee. So how are they going to have access to the information in the grant? All of those sorts of things are questions you want to be able to answer before you actually start putting your assessment together. Can be really useful as well to have a skim through what the application portal requires, if it is on a portal, because there might be some examples of necessary evidence or inclusions that you weren't aware of before. So a few of those things we'll go into a bit more detail when we talk about grant libraries and evidencing of applications, but some things to be aware of would be things like more and more often funders want to know get copies of the CV or resume of key staff who are going to be involved in a project, or position descriptions if you're going to be recruiting staff for a project. You need to have all your business details if you've got, your ABN, your insurance certificates, all those sorts of things. So it's a good idea to flick through what the requirements are and get a sense of what documents you need to gather before you actually go to write the application. Okay. So now we look at planning, and we start planning with our grants reference library. And this is going to really help you out when it comes to first putting information together in your answers to assessment questions, but also in terms of providing the evidence that you need to support your answers, because a lot of grants now require that you actually upload or send in different documents to support different parts of your answers. So audited financial statements are a big one. I know, for example, with the Skilling Queenslanders for Work grants that are currently open, they require 2 years of audited financial statements, your most recent 2 years as well, which can get tricky if it's shortly after end of financial year. Your business details and resumes of key staff I've already mentioned. It can be useful to have already written up a couple of brief descriptions of your organisation and its history, as well as previous programs and accomplishments. This is because a lot of grant applications will have a question about that. You might have, a very little space to answer, 50 words to give a bit of an overview of your organisation, or you might have quite a bit more space to detail how you've successfully run a program or used grant funds in the past. And if you've got that summarised already in your reference library, you're going to find answering those questions a lot easier. you can just sort of tweak what's already there. It can also be really useful to save any grant applications that you previously put in, and any feedback you got for them, whether you got the grant or not. And I know that none of us like to have reminders of the things that didn't work out, so you might want to just bin any any grant you received back where you didn't actually get the funding that you were hoping for. But chances are there'll be really useful feedback in that that you can then use to improve your future applications. So I think about it sort of like an assignment at university or TAFE or school, where, you know, it's never nice if you get a lower mark than you want to get, but the marker will have given you really useful tips about how you can improve going forward. And it might be that, you know, you provided some really useful information, but you missed out key points, or that what you said was very positive, but there wasn't enough detail, or you didn't provide the right supporting documents, those sorts of things. And you can use all of that feedback to then improve your next grant application. And this, if you do have the grants reference library, if that's something that you go with, it's also really useful because it becomes a single point of truth for other people who might be involved in writing grants as well, whether working with you on the same grant or doing different grants. And if it's established within your organisation and it's recognised that it's important to keep it up to date and make sure that's where everything is saved, then everyone is working off the same material, everyone's on the same page. And can also help highlight when there's particular types of information that you're likely to need for a grant, where, say, one person usually has access to that information, but that person may not be available all the time. So the one thing that I always think of with this is what if I need those insurance details or bank details and I need them quite urgently to get an application in, you know, it's due later today and the finance officer is sick, right? Or there's always an admin officer in any organisation who knows much more about the organisation than anyone else does, and they're really useful as a single point of truth. But if they're on holiday, what are you going to do? So we've got the grants reference library, so all these resources together. Then we need to start thinking about who needs to be involved in the application process more broadly and how long it's likely to take to get everyone on board and doing what they need to do. So when we think about key players, there's probably a few more than you would expect to have in writing your grant application. This is because you probably need approvals from people. You probably need someone who's not involved with the actual writing to read it, because they're going to have, again, reviewing other people's work, we're more likely to find issues with it than if we review our own work. You'll need to talk to a finance person, maybe the treasurer. If you're a completely voluntary organisation, it might be a finance officer or manager. If you're in a larger organisation, all of those sorts of things that you don't necessarily think about when you start developing a project idea. You're likely to need to talk to teammates or people who will be in charge of recruiting new staff if you are going to be expanding staff on the basis of having a new project to roll out. So you've got that human resources side of things. You've got practicalities. You might need to talk to partners. You might need to check, for example, that the resources like the room or the vehicle or the IT material that you need are going to be available. So all of those sorts of things just mean there are many more people than you're likely to realise who need to be involved. What we suggest for getting everyone on the same page is what we call a kick-off meeting. This is where everyone who's going to have a role in a funding application or rolling out the project once it's done are brought together for the very first meeting. They may not be involved in sort of an intensive way as you develop the application, but at least for that very first meeting where things start to be nutted out, get everyone there, get everyone on the same page, and set up those lines of communication that will be essential as you're developing the application and the project if it gets funded. Also a good time to hear what different people's perspectives are, help identify problems that need some troubleshooting, and really clarify expectations. So one of those things with partnership building or relationship building within the workplace, when we need to collaborate to pull something off, is that often different people who are involved have slightly different ideas about what's being done, what the requirements of them are, what they can expect from other people, those sorts of things. So a kick-off meeting is really an opportunity to get all of those things nutted out, or at least get some progress towards that. And what we would suggest, having got everyone together for the kickoff meeting, is then you map out a timeline. And just like with backcasting, as we talked about in the program logic, we're looking at working backwards from the hoped for outcome, which in this case is getting that application in before the deadline closes, and then working backwards from that to get a structure for step-by-step tasks that will get you to getting that application in. When you're thinking about how much time everything takes, assume that everything will take a little bit longer than you expect, particularly when someone else needs to be doing it. Think about the possibility of people being on leave or unwell, all of those sorts of things, and think in real detail about the tasks that are being assigned. It can seem on the outside or from a quick look that a task will be really simple when, in reality it might be much more difficult or take a lot longer than you expect. I know things like requiring a letter of support to add to your application can seem like it's quite simple. Well, I call so-and-so from this organisation, they'll email something over to me by the end of the week, but so-and-so's on leave, and then they send through the first letter they write and it doesn't have all the detail I need, so then I have to get back to them with the feedback, and then we have to get the next letter in and that sort of thing. The timeframes can really blow out that way. So think about not just building in enough time to do each of the tasks that's necessary, but also building in a bit of a buffer for things to go wrong that you don't expect, or for things to just take longer than you expect them to. It will be really important to have a way of monitoring when things are done. This could be project management software. So that's what we use here at QCOS, because we have so many different teams doing so many different things, and often needing to, someone in one team will be helping with one aspect of a project in another team. So that allows us to keep on top of those things. We can allocate tasks to each other within that software and see what's done and what's not, and all of those sorts of things. So if you have project management software at your work, or you have the resources to get it, that can be useful. But of course, a lot of community organisations don't have those sorts of resources. So it could be as simple as putting together a spreadsheet or something on, on Dropbox or Google Drive or whatever it is that everyone notes in when they've completed a task. It might be having a really quick meeting once a week if everyone's on your work site on the same day, to check in what's been done and what hasn't. But you really must have some kind of a process for monitoring what's done and making sure that you identify when things aren't being done in a timely manner, because that's one of those things that will really trip you up if you're not on top of it. All right, we also, as you get to the end of your planning process, really, really strongly recommend you have a checklist for those really key tasks that must be done before you start writing your application or trying to get your application in. You can see on the screen, these are some of the things that we identify as being really key to most projects, most grant applications. And we've got these, and you'll see in the plan on a page resource that I send out. On the back of that, I believe it is, there's a checklist like this, but of course you can easily develop your own checklist and tailor it to your particular grant. But just having a sort of a master list or something like that can be really valuable. All right, so we are about a little over halfway through our time, and we're about to jump into the actual question of writing out your responses to criteria. I'm going to take a 10-second break and have another drink of water, and do just pop any questions or comments into the chat if you've got anything about the planning process that you would like to ask or get some clarification on. And otherwise, we'll start in on writing in just a minute. Letitia, yes, you will get a copy of the presentation in an email either later today or tomorrow. And you'll find that everything that I talk about as being linked to is either in the PowerPoint itself as a hyperlink or will be in the email. All right, so let's get into actually writing your responses to criteria. Now, the tricky thing, well, both the tricky thing and the useful thing in grant applications is there will be very specific questions that you have to answer. So we're going to give you some tips for breaking down the kinds of questions that you're likely to come across and then making sure that you're covering every aspect of them in your responses. We're going to talk through the kinds of supporting evidence that you're likely to need, how to put that together, and some really common mistakes to avoid. And then we're going to talk about a bit of a triple checking process, which is always necessary. It just will not be everything, every I dotted and T crossed when you do your first run through putting your application together. It's inevitable there'll be something missing or unclear or that sort of thing. So we'll have a bit of a chat about that. Our key point here is to think before you write, really, and to think about what the purpose of your writing is. When it comes to responding to these assessment criteria, as one of our participants mentioned earlier, writing within a really strict word or character count is very, very hard, especially when the questions in grant applications often have a lot of detail or are multifaceted. So one thing we like to point out is that this is not writing the way that we would usually write. So you probably learned in school this sort of funnel kind of idea for creative writing, or writing really good letters or emails, those sorts of things in the days when we used to write letters. In terms of, I know we had a focus on this funnel approach in writing assessments. So you go with lots of scene setting and detail and characters and, lots of descriptive words about, whether it's the weather or the scenery or those sorts of things. And then there's a really interesting story and you're holding off the important information, and then the twist comes later on. And that's a really fabulous way to think about writing a really interesting story, but it is the absolute opposite of what we need when we're writing grant responses. So instead, we want to put the key point, the absolute, top line message at the very, very front of our response to an assessment question in a grant application. We then want to add any supporting points that we have and any examples or evidence. So what we're going to do to show how this works is go through one of the criteria for the Community Innovations Fund, and show how we would pull that apart and how we would think about starting to craft a response. So one of the criteria, I think it's criteria for assessment criteria 3, off the top of my head, is for the SIF grants, is to demonstrate strong community connections, partnerships, or alliances. And when we start thinking about this, we can start to see how what we need to do there is really quite complex. So we need to focus on the local community. We can see in that answer that community is really important. So we will need, before we even come to write that response, we will need to have considered what the local need is, what the local conditions are, whether there are services that are already in place that are meeting or partly meeting the need, and how we might work in with that to achieve the aims of the SIF grant fund, but in a way that's really, really specific to where we are. So funders won't want to be duplicating services that are already there, and they won't want to be funding projects that seem like a good idea but aren't actually relevant to the local area. So what seems like quite a simple criteria at the outset, you can see is a lot more complex, at least in the thinking that needs to go into it, than we might originally think. So the full text of the question there is a bit more lengthy, but basically that we need to consider the local need, identify existing services and demonstrate how they will use these community connections, partnerships or alliances to meet the identified need. And we need to pull that apart to make sure that we're addressing every aspect of that. What we suggest is to map out a sort of skeleton structure for how you might do that. And what will happen with the portal applications, assuming that you're using a portal to apply, is that there will usually be a character limit. So character being letter, number or space, or punctuation in an answer, or maybe not punctuation, don't quote me on that. We've broken it down into words just because that's a little bit easier in terms of our example, but it probably won't be an actual word count in your application. It will be a character count instead. So just as a sort of hypothetical, say we've got 400 words to respond to this particular assessment criteria. How can we make sure that we're fulfilling everything that the question is asking for in that? We might think about different chunks of the question. So we know with the Community Innovations Fund, we need an innovative idea. So we'll have to have some part of that dedicated to what's innovative in what we're proposing. We need to really clearly show the local need is there. We need to show that there is an impact on the local community, how our project really responds to that local need and that community understanding that we have, and then what our partnerships or alliances are that are going to help us meet that need. And with each of those, we want to think back to that pyramid we showed earlier. What's the key point, the key message, and then what's supporting evidence or examples we can use to support that key point. Now we have an example of, again, a fictional but quite a common type of response that might be given when it comes to a criteria around strong community knowledge and connections. And again, this example is from the Community Innovations Fund, but there is often a question or a series of questions around community knowledge and connections in a lot of grants that are out there. And what we've got here is a bit of an overview of an organisation, kind of, see, this is like, you know, this is what we're doing, we're pretty good, this is what we've done before. And it seems really positive on first read, and it is really positive on first read. But the thing with responses like this is that they don't give the specific detail that is being looked for. And this is why we really encourage this breaking down and pulling apart the question and then developing a response to it, because, yeah, on first glance, what we're seeing here is great. You know, they've been delivering a skills development program. They're having really great, you know, outcomes from it. That's very, very positive, but it's not going to pass muster as an assessment response. And that's because every aspect of an assessment question in a funding application will be allocated a number of points, and any aspect that isn't covered won't get any points. So I won't read through this again. I know it's a bit tedious to read through text on a screen, but if you want to refer back to it, it'll be there in the presentation. And what I'll show you now is how we would think about structuring a response to a question like this. So the first thing we'd want to do is look at the point of innovation. And we'd start with a key point, and then we'd add in an example or some evidence that we could use to support it. And Another tip that we'll come to a little bit later, but you can already see in these examples, is to match our language to the language that the funder uses. So in terms of innovation, we might say that through our established program, we've been supporting a relevant cohort. And then by partnering with another service, we would like to expand that and reach a new, reach the same cohort, but to support them in a different way. Now, partnering we know is really important in SIF's programs. So by using that language, making it really clear, the assessor is really easily able to see that we're covering that aspect in our response. So matching language can be really, really useful. Again, I won't go through these sort of line by line, but you will be able to work through them in the presentation that you'll receive all the slides on, and you can see how we have mapped out our responses and made sure that we cover everything, and how we've also integrated evidence into answers. And we'll be looking at evidence and what you might use to support your application a little bit later. And there is actually one part of that response that isn't as we have suggested making it, and that's just to see if you do a little bit of critical thinking as you're working through that yourselves. The key thing to think about when you're answering the assessment criteria, though, and what we have done in suggesting an alternative answer there, is to really address every aspect of what the funder wants. And what the funder wants is made clear in those assessment questions. So you will see you know, and an assessment question might unfortunately be sort of 4 or 5 lines of text with a lot in there, but if you take that time to tease it out, you will see what matters to the funder and what they want you to show. You also get the opportunity in writing your responses to show your understanding. And this is where getting really clear and having all of that background work that we talked about, developing your project plan, making sure you're really across what the community needs are, all of those sorts of things will be really useful, because by doing that work, you've got all of those areas of knowledge and understanding that you have, you know, you're embedded in your communities, you know these things, but by working through a structured process and spelling them out in a project map, you have them at the tip of your fingers, basically, and you'll be better able to really clearly and simply get that onto the page, as it were, and show the assessor that understanding than if you hadn't done the preparatory work. You also get the chance in responding to your selection criteria to show what it is that you are offering that is unique. So it might be that you have a staff who are particularly knowledgeable and skilled in working with a particular target cohort. Or you might have experience delivering a type of program that is really valuable but hasn't been used with a different target group before. You know, you might have such extensive relationships with the networks and the other service providers in your area that by funding you, the funder is also sort of getting the value of all of those interrelationships and how those will help your participants and your community. And that's a value they wouldn't get if they were funding an organisation that didn't have those connections. So this is your chance to really highlight what is special and what is valuable about your organisation and what it offers. Now, in responding to these assessment criteria, there are some basic tips to just come back to over and over again. And I would suggest once you have drafted sort of your first draft of a response to a particular question, come back to this list and ask yourself whether you've met each of these. So the first is just to be clear about what's being asked and what you need then to include in your response. So that's what we did before, of pulling apart all the different aspects of an assessment question and ticking off that, yes, I responded to every single one of those. You need to be clear and concise and comprehensive, which is a kind of hard thing to balance, but we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes as well. You need to plan those key messages and make sure they're right up front. Don't bury them at the bottom of your answer. Start out with them and you think about it as a topic sentence in a paragraph. You need to provide some support to back up your claims. And again, this is something we'll talk about shortly. It is becoming more and more important to funders to see evidence-based proposals. And you need to match the amount of, basically the amount of words that you dedicate to each aspect of an assessment criteria to what seems to matter to the funder. So there'll be things that really matter to you, that matter to you for good reason, but that aren't relevant to assessing your application. So your organisation, for example, might do phenomenal work and you want to, you know, have more space in talking about the background of your organisation to highlight the amazing work you do, but the funder hasn't allocated points to that. So if you use part of your word count on it, all you're doing, you're not winning any points in that way. All you're doing is using up word count that could be dedicated to things that matter to the funder. And when I talk about points, the allocation of points, I mean that quite literally. And this is, of course, every funding process is a little bit different, but the common practice is to allocate a certain number of points to each aspect of an application in its assessment, and then to rank or compare the points of different assessments in deciding who gets funded. So if you've got a really highly competitive funding round, you might you might put in an excellent application that hits almost every point and is only missing a few of them, but you don't get funded because you're up against applicants that covered everything that was asked for, and because it's and covered it in detail or provided that extra bit of evidence, and because it's a really competitive round, it's only those very, very, very top ranked applications that get funded. Now, we do have tips from assessors themselves, and this is one of the benefits, I suppose, of being a peak body at QCOS, but also of working with different departments to provide this grant writing training, as we do get to hear directly from them about what they look for or the common problems that they see. So one of these is what I've already said about matching language. So use the language in your assessment responses that the funders use. That makes it much easier for them to navigate. Make sure you're responding to every point and every part, as we just talked about. But this is the one I really want to highlight from this slide. The assessment criteria is usually the only tool that assessors have to review your proposal. And why this matters is because it goes to the heart of what we're going to talk about shortly, about being clear and comprehensive in writing your responses. Your organisation, its history, its the amazing work that it does, you know, the capacity that it has to manage grant funds, the successes with previous grants that it's acquitted, all of those things are likely to be unknown to your assessor if you don't include them. And similarly, your idea might be really, really brilliant. You know, your program might have, you might have excellent ideas for how to engage a particular group who are at risk, say, or how to meet a gap, as you know, a major critical service gap. But if you're not really specific in explaining how that will work, your assessor has nothing to go on. They can't see the idea that's in your head. You know, they can't see what is valuable about what you're offering. All they can see is what's in your assessment responses. So we've got another example here where we'll try to tease out a bit about how you can use those ideas from the assessors to improve how you might answer something. So the first assessment criteria for Community Innovation Fund grants is that the proposal demonstrates excellence and innovation in responding to social isolation and loneliness. So if I'm sitting down to start drafting responses, the very first thing I do, again, is I'm going to pull that apart. What does my proposal need to demonstrate? Well, it needs to demonstrate excellence in innovation. So that means I need to make really clear in what I write that my program is new in some way. It's novel. It hasn't been done before. I'm not saying, I know we can do this because we've done it before and look how successful it was. That might work for another grant, but it won't work for the Communities Innovation Fund. I need to show what's new in what I'm proposing. But I also need to make sure that I'm clear about how it responds to social isolation and loneliness. And one trap I could fall into here is assume that the assessor reading the project proposal that I'm putting forward will just see how it addresses isolation or loneliness. But what I need to do is make really explicit what those connections are. So I need to say how what I'm proposing will lead to reduced isolation, not just put forward what I'm proposing and think, well, anyone would just know based on reading that it would have these effects going forward. I need to be super clear about that. But there's a little bit of a hidden thing that needs to be addressed here as well, which is if it's going to respond to social isolation and loneliness, I need to first establish that social isolation or loneliness is a problem in my community. So even if I show that I've got this new idea and I show how if I did these things, it would lead to reduced social isolation and loneliness, if I haven't established that I have a problem with social isolation in my local community, in the target group of interest, I'm not going to be quite covering everything I need to. So that's the trick with pulling apart these assessment criteria, is we need to be really, really clear in mapping out what all of the aspects are. So I would be thinking here about creating a response, thinking again about mapping out my response in advance. So the first thing I'm going to think about is demonstrating that social isolation and loneliness is a problem in my community, because that's the basis on which I'm making this application. Everything else is irrelevant if social isolation isn't an issue. So I'm going to think about a statement about that. And then if there's some evidence I can use to support it. So maybe a university recently did research in Southeast Queensland and shows that, you know, my area in South Brisbane, south of Brisbane, has higher levels of self-reported loneliness or isolation than other areas do, or that it has increased over the last 5 or 10 years. Those are the sorts of things I want to be thinking about. So that's going to be the first part. And then I'm going to think about what the project is that I'm offering, how I'm going to be addressing that social isolation and loneliness. So I need to give a bit of a description of what my program is and how it will work in practice. But then I also need to show how that will then lead to lower social isolation or loneliness. So what is it that I'm going to do in that process that will logically lead on to social, more social inclusion or engagement? And if your sort of thinking is nice and sharp, you might recognise that this is actually a question about your program logic. What's your problem statement? Does the problem exist in your area? What are you planning on doing about it? And how does that logically relate to this sort of outcome, which is reduced loneliness and increased engagement? So that's how I would go about approaching a question like that. And again, this is just an example grant that we have here, but the same process will work for whatever grant application you're looking at. Something that is often forgotten about or overlooked in these processes is that evaluation is going to matter as well. And we might think about how we can start integrating evaluation while we're planning our project and save ourselves a lot of headaches down the track. If your particular grant that you're applying for requires you to outline evaluation, as the Community Innovations Fund does, that's going to be even more important. But even if your grant application doesn't require you to outline evaluation, we really strongly encourage you to be thinking about this beforehand. It's going to be important internally for your team, your staff, your volunteers who are involved. They'll want to see the evidence that what they're doing is worthwhile. Evaluation throughout the project can also help you make sure that you're getting done what you need to get done. And planning your evaluation beforehand can help you see areas where what you expect might not be realistic. And that can be really useful in evaluating whether you're likely to meet the key performance indicators or required outcomes of the funding. And one of the things that sort of pays off with this is that you can then, if you do roll out a project and you evaluate it well, that evaluation then provides a bit of input into your grants reference library, and you've got ready to go data right there to support future funding applications. Now, I'll note that the department, and that is the acronym for the department. Oh, actually, I think there's a bit of a typo in there. My apologies. But the department does require for the Community Innovations Fund the use of the University of California, Los Angeles loneliness scale in CIF projects. So if you are looking at applying for CIF when the round opens, it's a good idea to have a look at that first up and see how you will integrate that into your work. So when you're planning your evaluation, you need to think about what your inputs are. So that's the resources that you or your organisation or your team offers, and that includes material resources, finances, worker time, all of those sorts of things. Your outputs are what you expect to deliver. So what are the activities that you expect to be delivering, or the services? Are you going to be, arranging group activities? Are you going to be providing transport to them? Will you be doing meals or refreshments? All of those sorts of things. Then we look at the outcomes you expect to deliver, and then the evidence that you'll need to collect to support that you achieve those outcomes. So in the CIF example, you would be using the UCLA loneliness scale before your participants start in your program, and then at the end of the program as an example. You might also use data like the number of participants at the events that you hold, their satisfaction. So for example, at the end of this presentation, you'll see a little survey comes up that asks you to answer 3 questions about it. And we do that as part of all of our activities because we want to get that real world data straight in about what's going well and what we can improve. And then we target sort of improvements in our webinars or our workshops or whatever we're delivering sort of on an ongoing basis. That's just one example of an evaluation input there. And you can think as well about other aspects of evaluation that might not come to mind as readily, like the reflections and the observations of the staff who are involved in, or the volunteers who are involved in rolling it out. They might have really useful observations or reflections to add. You might partner with a research body. For example, I know of one program in North Brisbane where they're partnered with one of the universities, and the university is running research on the outcomes of this particular program and how those compare with other types of programs that look at addressing the same issues, for example. But it doesn't need to be that sophisticated. You just need to have a plan in place for how you'll get real usable information about how useful your program was. Now, again, I'm just going to say evaluation is a bit of a tricky one. That's what our webinar next week that includes more about project logic is on. So feel free to come along to that if you would like more on evaluation planning. In the meantime, we are going to have a focus on evidence. So this is what I mentioned earlier, to start thinking about what you can put in your application responses that can support what you're saying. Now, in a number of the portals that are used for grant applications, you will actually have boxes, drag and drop type boxes that you might be familiar with using from doing reports at work or using, Dropbox or those sorts of things. You just literally have a file on your computer and you drag it over and you drop it into the box on the portal. the kind of quality of evidence that you use, though, is going to be really important. It's not enough to, make sure that you have dropped a budget or a letter of support in that box. It needs to be, really reliable and usable for the assessors. And this is again one of those sets of tips that we get from assessors themselves. What the assessor has told us is that they ask themselves these questions when they are evaluating the proposal and the evidence for the proposal. They ask themselves whether the project is feasible, whether the project represents value for money, and what evidence is there for those things. So let's have a little bit more of a look at what being feasible means. First up, we need to have the resources to carry out what we're planning. So when an assessment question asks something about your organisation's experience in acquitting grant funds, for example, if your organisation has never acquitted a grant before, or you have had a grant but then not acquitted it properly, that's going to suggest that your organisation has limited capacity to manage. Whereas if you have documented experience of acquitting grants in the past, and perhaps you can upload as evidence of that an acquittal report or a project report, that's going to be really favourable there. If your organisation says it can run the project and it has the physical space or the partnerships or the workers who are obviously well experienced in a given area, and there's evidence for that, that's just going to make it much more, comfortable for the assessors to advance your proposal. So make sure you've got things that back that up. If you say that you've got staff who have relevant knowledge and experience in that area, you want to be following that up with, please see the staff CVs attached. And then the staff CVs are there and the assessor can open it and they can see that this staff member has 15 years in the community sector working with culturally and linguistically diverse communities, or this staff member has been working with young people who are disengaged from school, or whatever it is that your cohort is, or whatever type of service you're going to be providing. You've made the statement and then you've put some evidence there that supports what you're saying. That's what they want to see. The other question is whether the project represents value for money. We'll talk again a little bit about budgeting in a moment. The big thing here is that assessors don't tend to be looking for the cheapest option. It's not about trying to give a lowball bid and hope you get it. It's about whether what you're offering is worth the investment. So one way to think about this is if you're looking to work with a group with really complex needs, you're going to have a budget that has a lot more required of it. A lot more funding will be needed for wraparound supports and more intensive supports than if your program is aimed at a target population with a lot lower level of need, that sort of thing. And your assessors will have a sense of what makes sense there. They will be able to see that if you plan, say, you're planning to run some programs to support people back into the workforce who've been disengaged. Well, if they're quite recently disengaged, people who've maybe lost a job in the last few months in an industry that's closing down, but they've got really strong work skills and histories, they're probably going to need a lot less support than, say, working with young people who have disengaged from school and have complex family and mental health problems. So that's what we're talking about when we think about value for money, is what you are offering to do worth the investment, not is it the lowest cost option. That's really, I guess, my point there. And what you can provide as evidence is that, and there's a lot of variation in what can be asked for, but there are a few really common things that are needed. So we've already talked about CVs. There are things along the lines of insurance statements and those sorts of business documents that are really useful. If you're working in partnership with another organisation or group, a partnership agreement or memorandum of understanding will be really useful. Your audited financial statements, as we've already mentioned, are really useful, and any information from previous projects that you've run, like project reports, are useful. And there are other types of evidence that you'd be familiar with from your assignments in education, or maybe if you do any report writing as part of your job. When we're talking about there being a need in a particular community, for example, we want to see statistical information about that. You know, if we're suggesting a particular kind of program, and we say that it has been useful in addressing an issue, then we want to see a research report that is referred to there that shows that it's useful, those sorts of evidence. Now, as I mentioned earlier, it is becoming more and more important to put forward evidence-based proposals. So there's not really much new on this slide. This is just summarising the key parts of an evidence-based proposal and why it matters for your funder. So this is backing up basically that you know what you're talking about when you make particular comments or statements about what is needed and how you're going to meet that need. But it has a couple of other benefits that you might not think of straight up, and one is that it might support your funder's understanding of the problem you seek to solve. And that can be important when a grant is not targeted at a specific problem or a specific cohort. Sometimes the funder's understanding will be quite broad, and then by providing that evidence base, you're actually supporting them to learn more about what's going on and why it matters, and that then strengthens your budget ask, basically. But an evidence-based proposal can also provide really useful information when you then go to evaluate your project at the end. So again, it's one of these things that can seem like it takes up more time in the planning stages, but it will save you so much time in the end if you're collecting that evidence and have it ready to go when you write your application. If you're going to use data as evidence, particularly for community need, and again, we do recommend using data, you want to target it to your community and make it quite recent. You know, if I'm wanting to explore the psychosocial needs of people in Mount Isa, for example, it would not be appropriate to use research or data that's been collected in Southeast Queensland. You know, if I want to say that there's a level of need in my community, I want to use data that's from the last few years, not data that's 10 or 20 years old. So those are the really, I guess, couple of really basic things when it comes to using data. Make sure it's specific in location and time if that's possible. If it's not possible, just be open about that. You know, try and find data from a community that's similar to yours in a relevant way, that sort of thing. And use a what's the word I'm looking for? A credible source of data. We've got a few listed here, and these the underlined material here, it does indicate a hyperlink. So each of these, the Queensland regional profiles, clicking on them will take you directly to the online platform for them. And they're all open data sources, so they're free to use. I'll also plug that QCOSS has data dashboards for a number of regions in Queensland where our amazing data analyst has gathered together information from different freely available data sources about different regions. So you might like to check that out. The key thing is to be using data that is reasonable and is credible. So it's from a known source, it's from, say, a university research body or a government research body, that sort of thing, not just, you know, Kelly's blog on the internet says this. Budget. Your budget is a form of evidence, although it may not seem like it. And we did have a question about budgeting before. So how to set up a solid budget was I think, the question. And that's exactly what we've got here. So a few things that you need to think about are first the guidelines for the particular grant you are applying for. As I mentioned earlier, Google the grant name and guidelines for funding or funding guidelines. It should be really clear what can and can't be included in your budget, the things that they will and will not fund. And if you need to be getting quotes or you have to estimate costs, make sure that those things are made clear in your application, and that everything that needs to be detailed is, it's often the case that an application will come in and it will sort of be administration costs X number of dollars, and that's just not good enough for a funder. They need to see how that's actually broken down, especially when it comes to the bigger grants. That they don't want to see a vague costing. They want to see, what are you actually going to be using this money on? And what they'll be thinking about is whether what you're proposing, the activities, the outputs that you're proposing and the outcomes you hope to achieve justify the costs that you're asking them to fund in your budget. They will also be asking whether the amounts that you've put in your budget are realistic. So you might think, oh, well, I want to put in a costs on the lower side because that makes it more likely that I'll get through. They'll think it's good value. But your funder should have a good sense of what's realistic. And if they see that you've put in an amount that just doesn't seem like it's going to support the work that you want it to do, that's gonna be a problem. That's going to be a weakness in evaluating your application. So just put together a budget where you've mapped out all of the kinds of costs you can think of and got realistic ideas of what kinds of amounts you're looking at. A couple of other things to think about are, when you think about staffing costs, if they're covered in the grant, you need to think about superannuation, possible award increases, work cover costs, all of those sorts of things. So have a chat to, if you've got a finance officer or the treasurer on your board or management committee, have a chat with them, look at your previous budgets for either your ongoing activities or one-off grants that you've applied for, and just try and map out absolutely everything that you could need to include. Think about what you will need to, on a really practical level, to run your project and get the outcomes you need. And also think about not just things that you want the grant to pay for, but the things that your organisation will provide or your partners will provide that don't need to be directly paid for. And that's what we mean by in-kind support. So say I'm running a program for young women who have disengaged from education, and I know from my research that they are quite likely to have experienced issues around domestic or sexual violence, mental health issues, and that sort of thing. I might partner with a counselling service or a young women's support service, and I can document in my application that they will provide, each week for 8 weeks, they're going to provide a 90-minute group for my 10 participants that I want to recruit. I can document that. I can give an approximate amount in terms of an in-kind contribution that they're making. So that would be the staffing and administration and resource time required for that group. And then what I'd do is I'd get a letter of support from the counselling or the young women's organisation detailing that, yes, we're committed to providing these to support this program. And that would all be evidence towards my application and showing that I'm considering sort of all of the resources that are needed to run my program and costing it effectively. Some examples of things that many grants won't fund, so you cannot include a request for them in your budget, would be capital expenditure, equipment, maintenance, renovations, and buildings or rents, or capital purchases like land and buildings. And grants often won't reimburse funds that have already been spent. So if you think, oh, well, I need to have these things, so I'll buy them in advance and then I'll sort of pay myself back with the grant fund, that's usually not going to work. Motor vehicles and things often are not included. There's no costing for the resources that went into developing the grant in general. and there will often be stipulations about who is appropriate to pay out of grant money. So grants often will not include payments, say, to consultants or payments for project management, that sort of thing. So you want to be really careful looking through, if you need to send a staff member interstate to get some training so that they have the skills and knowledge necessary to deliver the project you want them to deliver, you need to really carefully look into the funding guidelines to see whether training and travel are expenses that would be covered, all of those sorts of things. So really quickly, because I can see that we are starting to run low on time, I'm just going to highlight some pitfalls that we hope that you have learnt strategies to avoid for some of them here. So failure to address assessment criteria is the biggie. Having unclear or vague summaries is a real problem. Not understanding your local community or its need. Mistakes cutting and pasting from previous applications is a big one, and you might think that it will save you time to do that, but it is a bit of a trap. The number of applications that come through and sort of the location is wrong or the numbers in the budget are wrong, those sorts of things is surprisingly high. And do get someone other than you to double check that your budget adds up, because that's another one. You'd be surprised how often applications go into funding bodies and the total in the budget is not actually what you get if you add up all of the line items. This kind of takes us to our final or penultimate point, which is to edit, proofread, attach and triple check before you submit anything. In terms of proofreading and editing, we've got a few key points here. So getting in under that word limit, just simplify your language, take out the adverbs, take out any word that isn't actually doing work itself. Some other tips include using bullet points to cut down on your word count. Those sorts of things will help you get in under that word or character limit, but also often have the benefit of making your meaning clearer if you're taking out unnecessary stuff. And concision goes hand in hand with being clear. Make sure that everything you're saying is doing some work. Focus on your best examples and evidence, all of those sorts of things. We have another video on the next slide. So again, I'm not going to play it, but you can just click on the link and you'll be able to get some more tips on clear and concise writing, which we really recommend. Double check that you have answered all the questions and have that list of the different bits of the questions that you've pulled apart. Just check that you've covered them all. Check that everything you've said is relevant, that your language matches that of the funding body, all of those sorts of things. We've already talked about these. What we're doing here is just a little bit of a recap. Some don'ts. Don't make unrealistic claims. My organisation is an industry leader is a really common kind of language to hear. That sort of thing doesn't do any work for you. And make sure you're including those examples and that evidence. Think about that structure for responses where you've got your key message and then your evidence or examples supporting that. Couple of apps around that can really be helpful. We suggest, if you possibly can, having a human being that you know and trust to look over things and highlight anything that is unclear or they don't understand or they think is irrelevant. If someone not familiar with your project can make sense of your responses, that's a really good sign. If you don't have anyone at all who can help, then there are apps like Grammarly and Hemingway that can be helpful. The next slide we'll pretty much skip past. It's just a reminder that you do need an application checklist, and we've got one of those on our Grant on a Page resource. And if you get through all of that, you're pretty much done. You will have to submit your application and take a bit of a break. But the work isn't over. If you get your funding application, you need to then prepare to acquit it. And acquittal just means expending the grant funds in the way that you plan to in your application. So we've talked about all of the strategies for almost all of these things in the planning process anyway. There's just a couple of extra points here about really making sure you're documenting everything as you go. And if you do, you'll have the added benefit of that extra evidence for future applications. So that's really useful. And whether you're successful or not, do make sure you ask for feedback, because even if you're not successful, or actually even if you are, you'll probably hear about a few things you could do to really improve your application next time around. We've also just linked there to not-for-profit law, who have some really useful guidelines for if you do get the funding that you're going for. We really recommend going there. So we're right on 2 o'clock now. So I just very, very quickly highlight that if you do get a fund from the Queensland Government, as I mentioned right at the beginning, you will be considered a functional entity for the purposes of the Human Rights Act 2019. So if you're a community in a community organisation, you probably care about human rights anyway. But if you're not familiar with the Act, the Human Rights Commission has loads of fabulous resources. They're really practical and easy to use. And we also have a human rights network here at QCOS that talks about how to enact human rights through your work. And so there's a link there to our community door resources. And that is about it for me. I apologise, I had to rush through the Human Rights Act stuff at the end, but there's links there that you can go to. I'm just going to check the chat to see if we have any other questions I've missed, which I don't think we do. So please do respond to the poll. We really appreciate your feedback, and we really do want to know what we can do better. Feel free to get in touch. You will get that post-event email pretty soon after this. So if the resources that you find there aren't quite enough, or you have a particular question that isn't answered, please do feel free to just flick us a reply email, and we will try to get back to you as soon as we can. Other than that, feel free to let us know if you apply for a grant and what the outcome is, because we love to hear about how those things go, and we often don't. So do us a favour and tell us what amazing work you're doing. And other than that, just a huge thank you to all of you for coming along today. I hope that you have got a lot out of it, and I really would like to hear what you thought and hear what happens with your grant applications. All right, thanks everybody.